Reisenauer, and I am the director of the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies here at Providence College. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's Quinn Family Lecture. We are honored to have a leading legal scholar speak to us about competing visions of women's rights in the United States, especially in light of the recent Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court. And we acknowledge that discussions of the issues concerning and surrounding this decision can elicit responses and reactions that can at times be quite strong. So we kindly ask all present this evening to graciously extend an attentive ear and a thoughtful mind to our guest speaker, and to demonstrate a respectful attitude towards everyone else in attendance, regardless of their particular stance on or approach to these issues. So thank you in advance for your kindness in contributing to a community of those who are together pursuing the truth in love. And hopefully this is something that we are all of us are aspiring to here at Providence College. So I now have the distinct privilege of introducing our speaker. Ethics and Public Policy Center fellow Erika Bachiochi is a legal scholar specializing in equal protection jurisprudence, feminist legal theory, Catholic social teaching, and sexual ethics. A 2018 visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, she is also a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she founded and directs the Wollstonecraft Project. Her newest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2021 and was named a finalist for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's 2022 Conservative Book of the Year. Ms. Bachiochi's lecture this evening is entitled Dobbs and Competing Visions of Women's Rights. And so we gladly welcome Ms. Bachiochi and look forward to her words of insight and erudition.
Well, I might just have to leave now if you're expecting erudition. Thank you, Father Augustine. It's really great to be here. I'm going to try to put a little timer here so I don't go too long. Really good to be back at Providence College. And just want to acknowledge that we have a cardinal in the room, so hello, Your Eminence. These are the things that we do as Catholics, right? So thank you for being here, and all of you, Provost, hello. So for the last half century, abortion rights in our country have been a privileged response to reproductive asymmetry, to the basic biological fact that though women and men engage in the same sexual act, it is women and not men who may end up pregnant. Indeed, in our time, abortion rights are often regarded as the sine qua non of women's rights, the core freedom that women require to be equal to men. Indeed, this is not far off from the claim made by the dissenting justices in the recent case overturning Roe v. Wade. According to Justices Kagan, Breyer, and Sotomayor, by overturning Roe, Justice Alito's majority opinion in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, quote, curtailed women's rights and their status as free and equal citizens. The court's decision consigned women to second-class citizenship. Now, we all know that Dobbs itself did not prohibit abortion, but just determined that the issue should mainly be resolved by legislatures instead of the court. But the response I have to the dissent and others who have lamented the decision is a different one that goes directly to this claim about women's equality and citizenship. For putting abortion rights at the very center of claims for equal citizenship, as the dissent does and as modern feminism has, would have struck the earliest women's rights advocates in our country not only as peculiar, but as evident that their movement had ultimately failed in its quest. The very earliest advocates of women's rights, both in our country and abroad, were not only opposed to abortion, as more and more people now recognize today, they also grounded liberty, equality, and rights on an entirely different philosophical and anthropological basis than women's rights advocates do today. And this led, of course, to a markedly different vision of family and of society. From Christine de Pizan in the 15th century, to Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 18th, to Sarah Grimke and those at Seneca Falls in the mid-19th, these thinkers articulated an approach to women's equality and rights based not upon liberal myths of autonomy, but on the common rational nature women and men share, a nature given by God and ordered to intellectual and moral excellence. On this basis, too, they agitated for robust moral and social responses to sexual and reproductive asymmetry, responses that were far removed from the techno-pharmacological response that we privilege today. So tonight I want to share with you this earlier vision of women's rights and see how it contrasts with the autonomy-focused view of rights today. And I want to do so just as a jumping off point through the lens of Dobbs, again, the Supreme Court case that just overturned Roe and its progeny. So the key question I'll be grappling with is this: do women's rights and abortion rights fit hand in glove as we've been led to believe for the last half century, or are the concepts distinctive and even in tension with one another? So I'm going to argue tonight that the latter is the case. So one more preliminary point before I jump in here. I am, of course, in no way arguing that the majority opinion in Dobbs defends this older account of women's rights that I will explore tonight. The Dobbs court had a different purpose altogether. The Dobbs dissent, on the other hand, is kind of a master class in the autonomy-focused account of women's rights that has a strong grasp on feminism today. Okay, so the opinion for the court, written again by Justice Samuel Alito, was very much grounded in history. In particular, the relation of 19th century abortion laws to 14th Amendment liberty. You'll remember that the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, ratified by the states in 1868, provides, in part, and I put it on the screen there, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, some of you here may immediately wonder why this language isn't actually protective of unborn human beings, and we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But what I want to draw your attention to is how Roe, on the one hand, and then Dobbs, on the other, interpreted this constitutional text. So rather inexplicably, truly there is no real explanation offered, the court in Roe held in 1973 that the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty, quoted here below the text of the 14th Amendment there, was, quote, broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. This assertion, which claimed to build on prior contraception cases, was roundly criticized at the time it was rendered. Both abortion fan and foe alike readily understood the difference between ending the life of a human being and seeking to prevent the creation of one. Liberty in our constitutional tradition is not licensed to do as one wills. And so pro-choice scholars have been working ever since Roe for a better constitutional foundation than liberty. And as in the more colloquial presentation of their cause, women's equality, or that clause, the equal protection of the laws, fits the bill, or so they think. Now, Dobbs, in overturning Roe and Casey, maintains that to understand the meaning of our constitutional text and the rights it protects, judges cannot just wave their hands towards one of its capacious terms, like liberty, here in Roe, or property, in the now infamous Dred Scott and Lochner cases, and then imbue that term with their own meaning. While a constitutional term's meaning is not absolutely fixed at a certain period of time, it certainly isn't up for grabs. And so to discern whether liberty, in the 14th Amendment, is broad enough to include a constitutional right to elective abortion, Justice Alito doesn't just distinguish between contraception and abortion, which he could have, and he does do that, but it's only part of his what he's up to in the decision. More centrally, Alito takes us back to look in particular at how the several states treated abortion at the time they were also ratifying the 14th Amendment. And he concludes in short, you don't have to read this all, I've highlighted the important portion, that it was simply incoherent to claim, as Roe did, that abortion could be an aspect of 14th Amendment liberty when nearly every state at the time of the 14th Amendment's ratification and in the years and decades following it had erected statutes prohibiting elective abortion throughout pregnancy. In fact, Alito points out that no one, until just before Roe v. Wade itself, thought that 14th Amendment liberty included the right to intentionally end the life of one's own child. The court in Roe, then, Alito claims, really created the idea out of whole cloth. But hold on, the dissent responds to the majority. Why do we care that the states that ratified the 14th Amendment didn't regard abortion to be part of protected liberty? Note that the dissent here concedes the historical point. Rather, the dissent says, discerning the status and contour of women's putative rights by looking at our country's history and traditions is a particularly bad idea, because obviously women were not part of the we the people who determined our laws until long after the 14th Amendment. Since women didn't have a role in ratifying that amendment or passing any of the laws of that period, nor did they have the right to vote till a good half-century later, such a history-dominant approach reduces women to the status they held in that history, that of, again, second-class citizens. Now, on this point of the dissents, one might wonder why they want to give any respect at all to the magisterial text of the 14th Amendment or any part of the Constitution, given that none of it was ratified by women. But here's the thing. Women have been able to vote since 1920, and no state, until very recent history, ever lifted all restrictions on abortion or claimed it was a fundamental liberty right, as Roe claimed. Women were, in fact, deeply involved in the debates in the late 1960s and early 1970s over state measures to weaken those very strong 19th century abortion prohibitions. Indeed, women were leaders on both sides of the abortion reform debate in the years before Roe, as they still are today. So it was actually 7 men in Roe v. Wade who took from women the right to vote their conscience and make their voices heard on the issue of abortion. For even before women could vote, indeed, while they were agitating for the vote in the late 19th century, they made their voices heard on abortion in all sorts of public settings. In fact, the 19th century women's rights advocates were rather opinionated about the relationship between abortion and women's liberty, equality, and well-being. From newspapers they published to speeches they gave, we now know that the earliest women's rights advocates in our country were categorically opposed to abortion. That women felt the need to seek out abortions revealed to these women's rights advocates just how deeply their society was failing women. Now, the Dobbs dissent explicitly acknowledges the first wave of women's rights advocates, whose movement had begun to take shape just before the ratification of the 14th Amendment. But the dissent makes no effort to understand their complex views on this issue, which I'm going to be getting into. Instead, the dissenting justices patronizingly write, and I quote, "Most women in 1868 had a foreshortened view of their rights. If most men could not then imagine giving women control over their bodies, most women could not imagine having that kind of autonomy," end quote. Yet had the justices or their clerks done the reading, they'd have found that these women spoke and wrote all about controlling their bodies. They just didn't think that control extended to taking the life of another body, the body of their own dependent unborn child. For they understood themselves to be mothers with all of the responsibilities of motherhood, not when their children were born, but when they were still developing in their mother's wombs. So take, for instance, Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president on the Equal Rights Party platform, the first woman to testify before Congress, and an ardent and radical advocate of constitutional equality for women. Woodhull recognized that mothers were, quote, directly charged with the care of embryonic life. For children's rights, she said, begin while yet they remain the fetus. In 1970, just 2 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified, Woodhull wrote in the most provocative of terms, quote, many women who would be shocked at the very thought of killing their children after birth deliberately destroy them previously. If there's any difference in the actual crime, we should be glad to have those who practice the latter pointed out. The truth of the matter is that it is just as much a murder to destroy life in its embryonic condition as it is to destroy it after the fully developed form is attained. For it is the self-same life, she says, that is taken. Or take as another example, OBGYN Alice Stockham, the 5th woman licensed to practice medicine in the US. In her popular 1889 book, Toxology, she writes, quote, many women have been taught to think that the child is not viable until after quickening, and that there's no harm in arresting pregnancy previous to the feeling of motion. Others believe that this is no life until birth, and the cry of the child is heard. But she continues, life must be present from the moment of conception, for logically, scientifically, when else would it begin? And then she moves to the moral conclusion she draws from the scientific one. Quote, by what false reasoning does the mother convince herself that another life, still more dependent upon her for its existence, with equal rights and possibilities, has no claim upon her for protection? The woman who produces abortion or allows it to be produced risks her own life and health in the act and commits the highest crime in the calendar, for she takes the life of her own child. She defrauds the child of its right to existence. These 19th century women's rights advocates thus courageously agitated for their rights to education and entry into the professions, within marriage and in civil and political life, in part so they could fulfill with men their responsibilities to their children, both born and unborn. And so I actually think it's the dissent who has a foreshortened view of rights. For the dissent grounds such legal protection, such rights, not on who we actually are as human beings, but upon the philosophical myth of autonomy that has taken great hold of our cultural imagination. That is, the putative right to abortion is built upon a view of rights that regards human beings as worthy of legal protection only insofar as they are independent of others. The pregnant woman, the dissent tells us on page 1 of the opinion, is an autonomous being, etymologically a law unto oneself, who owns herself, they say later. She can thereby rightfully expel, in this kind of philosophical lens, her child from the property that is her body if she so wishes, much as a property owner can use force to expel a trespasser. Because the unborn child is utterly dependent upon her mother for her well-being, her life is not worthy of recognition or protection until viability anyway, when that second life, the dissent tells us, is capable of independent existence. So that's why viability is this sort of hallowed, time, is because it's independent. The child can live independently. But autonomy or independence is an odd way to ground rights, since, well, no human being is ever autonomous or entirely independent. We all come into the world helpless and dependent, and usually exit that way too. And throughout our lives, indeed, throughout each day, we are profoundly dependent upon one another. As a child, that dependency properly calls forth duties from others, in particular, our parents. And as we grow, others' dependence upon us calls forth responsibilities on our part. This interwoven interdependence is not a human reality to escape, as if we ever could, but to lean into, as it is the basis of human solidarity, authentic love, and moral maturity too. From this perspective, if there's a party over there and anybody would prefer to be in there, feel free. From this perspective, then, it is the unborn child's state of existential dependence upon her mother that makes her especially entitled to enveloping care and nurture that only her mother can give, a solidaristic sharing of one body with another body, mother with child. And so, well attuned to the inescapable human reality of interdependence, the earliest women's rights advocates grounded their rights claims not in the mythical ideal of autonomy, but in the common responsibilities we owe to one another. But of course, the vast majority of women's rights advocates in the 19th century were not scholars or philosophers themselves. Sarah Grimke is a notable exception. So they turned to a key philosophical figure to help them make their rights claims justly. And that figure was 18th century English philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. So let me now turn, much too briefly, to Wollstonecraft's formative visions of equality, liberty, and rights before returning to the women's rights advocates of the 19th century, that era on which Dobbs was properly focused. Now, I often give an entire book talk on Mary Wollstonecraft and her views about rights, equality, liberty, duties, virtue, etc. So this is going to be a very shortened version, so hopefully you'll get a sense, and my book is dedicated in part to this. So Wollstonecraft's best-known work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was published just 2 years after she anonymously published A Vindication of the Rights of Men, the most widely read critique of Edmund Burke's famous 1790 defense of the English monarchy. Wollstonecraft wrote these treatises during a time of marked political and social change. The American and then French revolutions had just thrown off old forms of hereditary rule in their respective attempts to enact new forms of republican government based on God-given rights, derived from the moral status of human beings as rational creatures. In both The Rights of Men and The Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft articulated this now familiar rationale for civil and political rights in the modern era. She then artfully extended its reach to women. Yet, unlike most of her contemporaries, Wollstonecraft's defense of rights was inspired by an older view of the human person, one which exalted the common human pursuit of wisdom and virtue above all else. So think, she's in that time with Locke and before him Hobbes and others who are grounding rights and, well, we'll talk a little bit at the end there, but on a kind of autonomy, on sort of self-government, self-ownership. She takes a different tack, but is writing in the same time, and also uses the term natural rights. So like ancient thinkers, like Plato and Aristotle, she believed that human beings' attainment of virtue, not their attainment of property, wealth, power, or status, would guarantee personal, familial, and societal happiness. As she wrote most famously, society can only be happy and free in proportion as it is virtuous. Rights, then, for Wollstonecraft were needed to virtuously carry out one's responsibilities to self, family, fellow creatures, and God. And I put those all on there. I usually go through them, but I won't. Yet even as she shared the ancient view of human excellence as a kind of imitation of or participation in the highest good or the divine, unlike the ancients, Wollstonecraft sought to universalize this quintessentially human quest beyond the landed classes. That is, persons are equal in dignity, thought Wollstonecraft, because each one, whatever his or her sex, race, or social status, is a rational creature capable of moral development. Men and women share in this endowment through the ennobling human capacity to reason. To quote there on the bottom of the screen, rise in excellence by the exercise of powers implanted for that purpose. But Wollstonecraft understood with the ancients that without one's reason properly directing the passions toward virtue, one's animal instincts would run wild, rendering a person impulsive, selfish, even brutal. Not governing the passions the way one should, he or she becomes a slave to those passions, and thus not independent in the way she understood it, which for her meant carrying out one's duties. She says the person who carries out his or her duties is independent, which to our modern ears is very confusing. Indeed, a freedom bereft of wisdom and virtue would, she thought, reduce men to beasts. And this was especially true, thought Wollstonecraft, in the intimate relations between men and women, the wellspring of the domestic affections she recognized as the source of every public virtue. So in this book about rights, a vindication of the rights of women, you don't hear so much about rights. You hear a lot more about responsibilities and the development of virtue. More still, were God's goodness not sought as the, quote, eternal rule of right, that by which we should judge all other claims of right, expediency and power would be all that remains to guide human actions. Man's arbitrary claims of power, heeding not the higher authority of God, were the source of every oppression in Wollstonecraft's view. And it was here especially that she made an important advance for women and other vulnerable groups, articulating an ancient truth that still admonishes today. Were there no higher standard of truth or virtue, no eternal rule of right, how would one judge a law or action to be unjust? Again, without eternal right to govern human norms and claims of right, persons would base their actions invariably on what is most useful, pleasing, or convenient to them, and the weak would fall prey to the strong. Such a relativization of truth and virtue was particularly harmful in relations between men and women, given the natural and social asymmetries between them. And so, Wollstonecraft's chief aim was to set things between the sexes aright. For in doing that, the whole human race, divided as it was between the sexes, might have hope of progressing in virtue and thus finding happiness. Wollstonecraft thus wished to transform intimate relationships between men and women into those governed by mutual respect and affection. In her view, these relationships were too often manipulative and transactional, like a commercial enterprise, or worse, entirely destructive of human dignity. And this debasement was of great consequence, and not just for the persons involved. Moral corruption of this most fundamental human relationship sowed corruption throughout the whole of society. So in Wollstonecraft's view, it was often libertine men, so vicious men, men without virtue, their ill respect for both women's reproductive capacity and sex's, quote, parental design that placed women in especially precarious situations. Forgetting the, quote, noble use of sex, quoting from the bottom there now, men with women indulge their desires, sometimes leaving women too weak to carry out the maternal duties that sexual intercourse potentially sets before them. They have, quote, sacrificed to lasciviousness, or lust basically, the parental affection that ennobles instinct, and the woman, now pregnant and abandoned by her sexual partner, may, quote, either seek to destroy the embryo in the womb or cast it off when born. Wollstonecraft blasts the idea that humanity had come so far from the, quote, barbarism of antiquity, at which time parents routinely exposed their children who were born but unwanted, left them out to die, infanticide basically. She returns to the ends of sex implanted by nature. Nature in everything demands respect, and those who violate her laws seldom violate them with impunity. Surely nature never intended that a woman, by satisfying an appetite, should frustrate the very purpose for which it was implanted. Wollstonecraft thus demanded instead that in situations such as this, the father maintain both mother and child. Such an expectation of paternal responsibility, she argues, might well bring an end to a, quote, abuse that has an equally fatal effect on population and morals. An advocate of sexual integrity and responsible fatherhood she was, of abortion she was not. And this, we ought to remember, was at a time when pregnancy was far more hazardous to women and embryonic development far less understood than in our own day. Indeed, for Wollstonecraft and the 19th century women who followed her, engaged and attentive fatherhood was the very best means to direct men's desires profitably by bringing them into the life of shared domesticity, and given men's power and influence in society, Such an orientation would yield benefits well beyond the good of his wife and children. Listen to how she contrasts the ill effects of the libertine man with the noble citizenship of the husband and the father. Quote, "From the lax morals and depraved affections of the libertine, what results? A finical man of taste who is only anxious to secure his own private gratifications and to maintain his rank in society. But the character of a husband and a father forms the citizen imperceptibly, producing a sober manliness of thought and orderly behavior." So when, a half-century later, the earliest American women's rights advocates put quill to parchment at Seneca Falls, they built upon Wollstonecraft's conception of rights as needed to virtuously fulfill their familial and social responsibilities. Equality of rights was grounded in the identity of the race in capacities and responsibilities. With the document at Seneca Falls expounding upon the, quote, "right and duty of both men and women to exercise their God-given capabilities of their common rational nature." The drafters of the convention's Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions also leaned, just as Wollstonecraft did, on a classical account of natural or higher law as the source of just positive law. Of course, Martin Luther King did the same, and many others who argued for their rights. These views about law extended to their views about the unlawfulness of abortion and the rights and duties involved. So with that all too quick background in Wollstonecraft's thought, I want to return now to how the 19th century women's rights advocates thought about abortion and its causes, especially because there's a complexity and wisdom here that is important for us kind of to tease out in light of this post-Roe era that we find ourselves in. And then finally, to conclude, I will sketch out in broad strokes how we got where we are today. So abortion in 19th century America was a strongly condemned practice, with the New York Times in 1871 referring to its growing prevalence as the evil of the age. Can you imagine the New York Times writing that right now? Probably not. The American Medical Association at that time was the leading organization of doctors that successfully lobbied for statutory measures to enhance common law protections of unborn children. In many cases, those very laws that Roe struck down and Alito collects in the appendix in Dobbs. So if you want to go look at what these 19th century laws look like, you can find them in the appendix in Dobbs. The AMA referred to abortion at any stage in the pregnancy as the unwarrantable destruction of human life. So the female doctors of the time, few though they were also aghast at the prevalence of the crime of abortion, rising in part due to industrializing economic pressures on the working class, no doubt. You heard before about OBGYN Dr. Stockham, and usually I tell the story of Dr. Charlotte Lozier, but I don't have time tonight. But consider another, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the United States. She wrote about how appalled she was at the underground abortion business of the infamous New York City abortionist Madame Restel. She was so infamous that actually her name became the way some would describe abortion, restletism. So Blackwell lamented Restel's reputation as a female physician, a description that Blackwell wrote in her autobiography, quote, exclusively applied at that time to those women who carried out her vile occupation. Restel's practice, according to Blackwell, was a, quote, utter degradation. I think I have slides here, sorry about that. Is an utter degradation of what might and should become a noble profession for women, referring, of course, to medicine. Blackwell wrote, quote, the gross perversion and destruction of motherhood by the abortionist filled me with indignation and awakened active antagonism. So doctors Blackwell, Stockham, and Lozier, alongside their peers in the women's rights movement, thus agreed with how the AMA characterized abortion as this unwarrantable destruction of human life. But they disagreed strenuously with some of the male doctors about the causes of abortion and whom should be considered culpable. The most vocal male doctors tended to place the blame for abortion on the women themselves. But the women's rights advocates faulted more strongly the legal male sexual prerogative, the men's ability, especially in marriage, well, obviously in marriage, to take his wife whenever he wanted as sort of a marital duty, and women's unequal status in marriage and society. So for instance, one male doctor wrote, "Is it not arrant laziness, sheer, craven, culpable cowardness, which is at the bottom of this base act? Have you the right to choose an indolent, selfish life, neglecting the work that God has appointed you to perform?" And the official 1871 AMA report on criminal abortion articulated a similar, if less virulent view, and this is the third one down. "The woman becomes unmindful of the course marked out for her by Providence. She overlooks the duties imposed upon her by the marriage contract. She yields to the pleasures, but shirks from the pains and responsibilities of maternity." Today, these 19th century doctors' words up on the screen form the basis of scholarly feminist claims advanced in amicus briefs to the court in Dobbs that the 19th century abortion statutes that Alito collected in his appendix were grounded in unjust discrimination against or sexual stereotyping, sex stereotyping of women. But what these scholars ignore, even though in many cases they are well aware, is that the women's rights advocates at the time strenuously disagreed with the AMA's characterization, even as the same had no problem with the abortion prohibitions themselves. Seeming to respond directly to the AMA report itself, but writing a bit prior to it, leading women's rights advocate Matilda Gage argued, for instance, "To my certain knowledge, this crime is not confined to those whose love of ease, amusement, and fashionable life leads to desire immunity from the cares of children, but it is practiced by those whose inmost souls revolt from the dreadful deed." Gage and many others in the women's movement pointed out that men's sexual presumption inside and even outside of marriage and subsequent lack of responsibility often put women in a position where they felt powerless to refuse and were left to deal with the consequences on their own. As Gage put it, quote, "Guilty? Yes, no matter what the motive, love of ease or desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life, and it will burden her soul in death. But oh, thrice guilty is he who for selfish gratification, heedless of her prayers, indifferent to her fate, drove her to the desperation which impelled her to the crime." Now notice, these are not head-in-the-sand euphemisms about abortion that we often hear today. Women like Gage saw the act for exactly what it was, but they also saw women's lives for exactly what they were. And so directly confronting the unjust sexual prerogative of men, these women, just like Wollstonecraft before them, called for male chastity. They actually had a slogan, "Votes for women, chastity for men," or what they called voluntary motherhood, the phrase used to agitate for a woman's legal right to say no to sex, even in, and at the time, especially in marriage. For these women, abortion and even nascent contraceptive methods were no answer to their ills, because these practices, in their view, further tilted the sexual playing field in the male direction, emboldening men to prioritize sexual intercourse and their own sexual satisfaction and to ignore the myriad asymmetries of the act, right? Not just pregnancy, but all sorts of other things as well. Alongside women's education, enfranchisement, and general elevation in society then, voluntary motherhood was the movement's response to the rising crime of abortion. Speaking for the movement as a whole, Sarah Norton, who had worked successfully for admission of women into Cornell University, cast blame directly on the perennial double standard. Is there no remedy for all this antenatal child murder? Perhaps there will come a time when the unchastity in men will be placed on an equality with the unchastity of women, and when the right of the unborn will not be denied or interfered with. So see here, rather than think of women's equality then as a kind of legal permission given to imitate irresponsible male behavior, to reject, as men so easily can, an unexpected pregnancy, as we kind of think of equality today, these women called upon men to meet women at a higher standard of sexual integrity, reciprocity, companionship, and care. One resolution of the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions at Seneca Falls read, quote, that the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should also be required of man, and the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. This was part of their full vision that Wollstonecraft II had articulated. Not just the right to say no to sex when a woman was not ready to become a mother, but as Sarah Grimke put it early on in the 19th century women's movement, a willing recognition of each other's rights and mutual wants, a joyful appreciation of the blessedness of parentage, the birth of healthy, comely children, and a beautiful home. And so these women at once, simultaneously, condemned the act of abortion while also calling for mercy and improved social conditions for women whose unequal social status and difficult circumstances led them to, as Gage says, the desperation which impelled her to the crime. Here's Gage. Much as I deplore the horrible crime of abortion, I cannot believe that a law would have the desired effect. It seems to me to be only mowing off the top of the noxious weed while the root remains. We want prevention, not merely punishment. We want to reach the root of the evil and destroy it. In other words, women like Gage were unconvinced that abortion prohibitions on their own would alter the circumstances that caused desperate women to abort. The wild success of Madame Rastell's underground abortion practice ought to have disabused anyone who assumed differently. Desperate women throughout human history have always resorted to desperate measures. This needs to be a warning to pro-lifers today. So what then did these 19th century women do? Well, they focused their efforts on those educational, cultural, moral, and legal means that would so improve women's lives that they would not feel the need to seek out abortion. In addition to advocating for equal rights in marriage, including voluntary motherhood, to property, contract, education, the professions, and the franchise, they worked for improvements in maternal and fetal health, founded female-staffed hospitals for women, and raised funds for the creation of maternity homes in which vulnerable mothers, abandoned, impoverished, or fleeing abuse, would be supported to nurture and raise their children with confidence. And just because this is a Catholic, sponsor here, I have to say that the church in particular has been continuing that work that they started for the last many decades, others too, of course. Yet their insights about the threat of undisciplined male sexuality and the beauty and goodness of both chastity and marriage were abandoned the very next century, just at that point in history when women were gaining the kind of influence in both the private and public spheres that could have made the expectation of sexual integrity culturally normative. If legal reforms to marriage and criminal law in the late 20th century finally worked to undo the institutionalized male sexual prerogative the advocates of voluntary motherhood had fought, the unfettered right to abortion entrenched that prerogative once again, unleashing a casual sex ethic favorable not to women, but to irresponsible male sexuality, just as these 19th century women had feared. So in the post-Roe era, abortion rights organizations will continue to fight state by state, and in Congress too, advocating abortion as the linchpin of women's freedom and equality. But note the fundamental reversal. That act that women's rights advocates once considered evidence of women's unequal status in society is championed as an essential component of women's equal status today. That act that poor women were forced to commit is now the privileged response to female poverty in our day. That practice that our earliest female doctors viewed as antithetical to a degradation of the medical profession has become understood by many to be a basic aspect of healthcare today. So what happened to what I regard to be this ennobling, edifying, ennobling vision? Some of you may find it horrifying, I'm not sure, but what went wrong? Well, you'll have to read my book to get the full story, but let me just say a few things, my very long book. It was immediately Margaret Sanger who intervened. So while Wollstonecraft and her 19th century successors blamed the want of chastity in men and the want of full moral and intellectual development in women for many social ills, Sanger pointed instead to women's bodies and their fertility as the chief cause of such ills, including poverty, famine, even war. She's very hyperbolic. Just labor laws, civil and political rights, and other progressive era gains, those, Sanger said, were mere palliatives, basically Band-Aids. No, we had to get to the source of the problem, she thought, the female body. So Sanger's wildly successful campaign for birth control, offered first as a prophylactic against abortion. She was actually anti-abortion herself and was hoping getting everyone on birth control would reduce abortion rates. Fundamentally, dramatically shifted our cultural response to reproductive asymmetry. Again, the disproportionate consequences of sex to women. No longer demanding chastity and social supports for mothers, as late 18th and 19th century women's rights advocates had, Sanger insisted upon each woman's social duty to technologically control her own fertility. Freed from the consequences of their fertility, women could be freed from the burdens of sex just like men. The just response to sexual asymmetry was no longer moral and social, it was technological. But Sanger's technological solution to reproductive asymmetry had unintended consequences that the early women's rights advocates had intuited. Unmooring sex from its reproductive potential dramatically increased sexual risk-taking, both within but even more so outside of marriage. And we can talk about how that happens if you want, but it might be really obvious too. With this increase in non-marital sexual activity came a spike in single motherhood and a growing demand for abortion too, whose legality eventually followed. All of these unintended consequences impact women, of course, far more than men. Thus began the running together of the sexual revolution with 1970s feminism. The movement my friend Mary Harrington has provocatively called bio-libertarianism, under the guise of a kind of second wave of feminism. Indeed, for the last half century, constitutionally protected access to both contraception and abortion gave men and women a presumed right to non-procreative sex, and with it, a putative right to sexual pleasure. After Roe v. Wade, sex was an act by which one fundamentally expresses, defines, and enjoys oneself, rather than the way new human beings enter the world. The natural and good ends of sex, which Wollstonecraft saw so clearly, have been totally obscured, and that in turn has erased from our mind's eye that which most fundamentally differentiates women from men. Women are designed, unlike men, to nurture a vulnerable human being inside our very bodies, even if we never do. This capacity is not determinative of being a woman, no, not at all, but obscuring it, even or especially as a means to equality, always ends poorly for women and their children too. But of course, there was more going on than just Sanger, and this section is for you political theory students. By the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, many women's rights advocates had traded Wollstonecraft's prioritization of the virtuous fulfillment of familial and social obligations, the foundation of her argument for civil and political rights, for John Locke's more individualistic and abstract conception of self-ownership. Likewise, many, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for instance, followed not the moral and philosophical approach of a vindication of the rights of woman, but instead John Stuart Mill's subjection of women. Liberty is thus slowly transformed in the Western world from a means to virtuously fulfill one's responsibilities to an essential human capacity with no particular goal or end. In Mill's telling, elites were not so much to direct their gifts to the common good, as Wollstonecraft thought, but rather to engage creatively in experiments in living. And Sanger, Locke, and Mill really eclipsed Wollstonecraft's influence, especially as we get into the mid-20th century. It's no surprise, then, that modern theories of women's rights built upon this liberal edifice, this edifice that really privileges autonomy, would end up placing the putative right to abortion at their very center. For if participation in public life and market work requires one to be autonomous from and unencumbered by natural obligations and beholden only to those voluntarily chosen, unexpected pregnancy and time-consuming caregiving find no place in them. Indeed, Hobbes's particular view of the state of nature, characterized by radically autonomous and self-interested male and female individuals, reductively equal in their capacity to engage in a war of all against all, is not so dissimilar from the rat race of late capitalist societies. Women with infants are at an obvious disadvantage against those without such caregiving responsibilities. As in Hobbes's mythical world, they may feel the need to discard them just to survive. But of course, reality is much closer to Wollstonecraft's view. We are first and foremost in relation to and dependent upon our Creator. And that most fundamental relation connects us all through the interchange of interweaving obligations and affections, which move outward from our domestic obligations and affections to our more public identity. So daughter, wife, mother, citizen, but also son, husband, father, citizen. Relationality is not only for women. And this basic starting point, of course, has an impact on how we think about the rights of women. Follow Hobbes, Locke, Mill, and Sanger, and you get women's rights advocates seeking to make women more like mythical, autonomous men, just as the Dobbs dissenters articulated. Follow Wollstonecraft and the 19th century women's rights advocates who followed her, and you can begin to reimagine rights born of our shared human nature and the natural and intersecting duties of care we owe to one another. Thank you.